Facebook Live. Lindsay Price here of Theater Folk. We've got a nice shiny day, sunshiny day behind me, and I know that a lot of you are looking forward to the end of the week in your classroom. Some of you have not started in the classroom yet. That's okay. Christmas will be here before you know it. It's literally going to be here in about 4 seconds flat. I'm talking about podcast today. Podcasts. The podcast. We got one. And I want to talk about using podcasts in your classroom. We have a podcast. It's called the Drama Teacher Podcast. And we look at a number of different things. One of the things we look at are production case studies, which are a director talking about their vision, their experience working on a particular show. We have interviews, a lot of interviews with teachers, just talking about something that's going on in their classroom. We have interviews with students. We have, I think that off the top of my head, I interviewed a bunch of students at the International Thespians Festival, which is going to be coming up on a podcast soon, about their experience. And Florida Thespians, I talked to a bunch of students about what their experience was in competition. And these are all things that, while a lot of them are aimed at the listener being a drama teacher, they are things that you can bring into the classroom. How so, you say? But let me tell you. Let me share. Okay, so one of the things that you can do, particularly with our podcasts, is create listening quizzes. This is something that would really work well as an emergency lesson plan. For example, you have students listen to our podcasts are usually about half an hour. They come up with a list of listening questions, which everyone has to answer either in groups or individually. So that's something that you can see that they're doing. They listen to the podcast. Our podcasts are usually about 30 minutes in length. And while they're listening, so that they're not just, woo into space, create a listening quiz to go with, so that as they're listening, there are questions that are coming up that match the progression of the podcast. And the great thing is, particularly with our stuff, is that you can look at a transcript and then quite easily pull questions. And then afterwards, you can actually, for an extra time, you can have students reflect on what they have heard. You can have them discuss in groups on what they've heard. You can have them create scenes on what they've heard. There's a bunch of different things that you can do. So, for example, I'm going to flip this. So here's one of our podcasts, which was a production case study. So this was talking to the amazing Lee Marshall, who's a drama teacher in Florida, high school drama teacher, and she did a production of To Kill a Mockingbird. And so we talked about her experience from coming up with the vision for the show to what the set design process was like for her, to what it was like working with a co-director. She very specifically wanted an African-American co-director to have that voice and have a perspective. She says there's a perspective that I just don't have, and she wanted to make sure that she was doing the show justice. And a lot about marketing and her experience marketing for the show and fundraising for the show. So all of our podcasts live on our the Drama Teacher podcast, which is on our website. So, for example, if you just come back, let me see if I can do this quickly. So this is our Theater Folk pod. That's really what we're looking for. This is our website. And right there at the top, we have our podcast. Click. This is the latest one. And of course, because I have gone here, production case this is gonna screw me because I have spelled it wrong. All right. Roduction. Case. Teal Mockingbird. There we go. Now we're back. Now we're back in action. Okay, so we've got everything here has the, so it's all online here. So it's something that you can give, for example, a substitute this particular link, and then they can play it from the computer, and you can just have speakers running in from the computer. You can also subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, but it's all right here. And then there are the transcript. So you can literally just go through here and see what the guest is saying and come up with questions, which I did. So for example, these are the types of questions you can have. What was Miss Marshall's year theme for her program? That's something you want when you're writing the questions for this kind of thing. You want something that is really going to jump right from what the guest is actually saying, so that it's not a guessing game. What it is you're just making sure that students are listening as you go along. For example, it would be really easy to know, along with To Kill a Mockingbird, what other show was part of her season, Antigone. You could also have, so there's direct questions that come directly from the transcript. So you can even take a transcript and make it part of a question. There is other ways of questions, such as reflections, right? So here we have reflect on the following, and you can take a quote from the transcript. As for this one, to show the beautiful story, sometimes you have to show the ugly part of it. And this might be a good post listening quiz reflection question, because that's something that students can take a long time with and actually use their own personal experience with a question like that. Same with the second one, right? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but wounds will ever hurt. That's a lie. Words do hurt, and words have power. That is something that a student could really go to town on in terms of a reflection, and use their own personal experience. And you can even use own experiences of what the theater is going on in your class. Same thing, here is not the same thing, but here is another thing to make sure that students are listening. Grab a quote from a transcript and take one of the words out. So for example, this is a quote from To Kill a Mockingbird. Let's fight with our heads. Put your blank down. Put your fists down. Right? So there's lots of, so you can actually just go to our podcast, grab the transcript, run through it, find something that you go, oh, this would be a great thing to do a question on. Right there, boom, that was the other play that she did. So that's one thing. We have got another great thing which would be really useful for your classes, is we have a working actor series. And so there were 4 that we did a couple of years ago. One was on commercial acting. Another one was on musical theater. And these were podcast interviews with working actors. So Heather McGuigan is a musical theater performer. And when we talked to her, she had just getting ready to start her 5th production of Mary Poppins. And you just go through the transcript and find questions. This would be a great one to come up with a list of pre-listening questions for. For example, if I was going to do this, let's see if I can type this one-handed. This may fail. Come with me, I may fail. What does it mean to make a living as a musical theater performer? Right? What does it mean to make a living as a musical theater performer? That's one. What does it? How often do musical theater performers work? What is it like to go on a national tour? What is it like to do a show multiple times? What is it like to perform, to sing 8 days a week? What happens when your voice goes out? You know, if you start to brainstorm, then the questions can come quite easily, and it's something that you can have a great discussion with your students. If you want to reverse engineer that as part of this process, have your students come up with the questions. If they were going to interview a musical theater performer, divide them into groups and have each group come up with 5 questions. What are the 5 questions that you would ask someone who is working in musical theater? Right? What are the 5 questions would you ask someone who has performed in many commercials? What are the 5 questions you would ask someone who has been on Broadway? Right? Take the students and have them come up with the questions, so that they are sort of in that thinking brain, right? So they are in that thinking brain and seeing, as when they listen to the podcast, did their question get asked? Do they think that the question that they came up with are better than the questions that I came up with, because I'm the one doing the interviewing? And then as a post-reflection, it's like, well, were your questions answered? If your questions weren't answered, what other questions did other questions come up in the course of the listening to the podcast, listening to the interview? What impression did you get of the actor who was being interviewed? These are all kinds of things. That's another thing that you can do, is that you can have it where you're creating a sort of an emergency lesson plan scenario, where you create the pre-questions, the pre-listening questions, come up with listening questions, and then come up with a reflection afterwards. This is something that can all take place in one class period, and you can even have an answer key, so that, the listening quiz could be marked in class time with the sub, everything happened in class time, so that all you're getting at the end of the class is that that everyone's done the work. 2, you can do the process where you are putting your students in the driver's seat, as it were, and have them think as if they were going to interview in this case, this is the wonderful Marnie Moreau, who was a commercial actor in Toronto. And it's like, okay, you have such and such actor in front of you, or such and such set designer, or such and such director, or such and such costume designer, or such and such stage manager, right? We have a lot of those folks on our podcast. What are the questions that you would ask someone who has done a lot of commercials, for example? And then when you listen to the podcast, you can listen to it in a couple of ways. One, listen to the interviewer. What questions do they ask? How do they ask the questions? Do they think that the interviewer is listening to the interviewee? Are there any points where the interviewer has missed a point that could have been brought up? Get your students really focused on their active listening skills from the perspective of being an interviewer. And then, in the post listening to the podcast, have them critique the interviewer. I'm never going to know, so it's, go to town. It's perfectly fine. So that's one sort of off-kilter way that you can listen to these podcasts. So it's not just listening to the content of it, but how is the content delivered? And what does that mean? And how does it change your students' perspective on what interviews sound like and how interviews are supposed to go? So that, I think, that's a really great one. So, and also, as well as listening to, these are really great. These are this series here, the Working Actor series with the commercial actor and musical theater. And there's also one, including that, a gentleman who worked at Stratford for quite some time. Okay. Another thing you can do is that we have a number of podcasts, which are in the student voice. Right? So this particular one is character interpretation, the student's point of view. There was a production that was really unique where I saw a middle school and a high school. Both did the same production. They did it on the same stage. And so you had two actors of pretty varying ages playing the same role. And so it was a great opportunity to get into the student point of view and the student mind on how does a 17-year-old play a character as opposed to a 12-year-old playing a character, and what do they bring to the table, and how did they maybe help each other out, or did they help each other out, and just what does it mean to have a character be played by two completely different actors and come from two completely different perspectives. What a great opportunity for your students to have a discussion on character. And is there only one way to play a character? Is there only one age to play a character? What happens when you have two people who are taking on the same character and approach it from two completely different perspectives? Right? Same thing. Have students, ask your students, is there only one way to play a character? Is a characterization set in stone? Right? Ask questions, come up with a listening quiz, have a discussion. And then the other student voice that we have is, I talk to students a lot when they're at competitions. And this particular one is from the Florida State, I had to check, I want to make sure. The Florida State Thespian Festival, where I interviewed some ensemble groups and some monologues and some duet partners, and just what is it like to compete, and how does competing differ than being on stage in a regular show, right? How do you choose a scene? How do you deal with nerves? So instead of students getting advice from a teacher or an adult, this is a great way to have students get advice on a particular process from their peers. And what is that like? Ask students, what do you think the most important advice is? What's the most impactful advice when it comes to competing? See how these students respond to their questions, and do you agree with what they say? Do the students agree with how these particular students are taking on competition? Basically, this is limitless, absolutely limitless. And then the last thing I clicked on this before. The last thing I want to make sure is that, so I showed you the questions for for Till a Mockingbird. We have a lot of these. These are my absolute favorite podcasts because you get to listen to a director talk about vision and how they implemented that vision with their students, how they implemented that vision with their cast, how they implemented that vision with direction and with costume and with set. And I just think so often that this is something that students can let go by the wayside, that directing is like, okay, we got to get everybody on stage. Okay, we have to get everybody from the beginning to the play to the end of the play, and that's it. When it's actually the director's job is to come up with an interpretation and then take that interpretation into all the different aspects of production and make it all one. You know, the director is the unifying force, and it's important that a director practices that. And the school level is the perfect place to practice coming up with a concept for a show and implementing it. And that's why these production case studies are a really great listen. If you've got a directing class, use these production case studies in your classroom and just listen to how directors take on a show. Okay, how are we doing here? Perfect. Okay, so the link for our podcast is in the description for this, and I just wanted, and they're free. They're free to listen to. They're free to download. It's not something that we're selling in any way, shape, or form. Take our podcasts, use them in the classroom, use them as emergency lesson plans, use them as reflection jumping off points. If you have a directing class, use them. Use those production case studies as a great jumping off point for discussion, a great place to start to get your students to grasp the concept of vision and implementing a vision and how to implement a vision in all the areas of production. If you have students who you're finding that maybe they're not listening to you as much as you'd like, get them and have them listen to the student voices so that they're listening to their peers and seeing how they feel about that. Get your students their critical thinking caps on and have them listen to the podcasts with the critical eye on the interviewer. How instead of listening to the content of the interviewee, how does the interviewer conduct the podcast? And do you agree with the way the interview is conducted? Are there missing points? Again, I'm never going to hear this. Please don't share with me. What a great critical thinking exercise, that it's not just a passive listening. And that's the point I'm really hitting home here, and I'm going to end this whole Facebook Live. Where are we? Facebook Live. That's the point I really want to hit home, is that to use a podcast in your classroom is not passive listening. It's not just throwing something on and having your students sit quietly for a half an hour and listen to something. It's all about what you can do to engage your student in that listening process, be it a critical thinking exercise on the interviewer, be it a listening quiz that they have to fill out as they go along and then reflect on after, be it a great exercise in getting a group of students, be they student directors or in competition, focused on and hearing someone else's opinion and deciding if they agree with that opinion or not. Okay, our link is in the description. If you have any podcasts that you listen to that you think would be really great for other teachers, please throw them into the comments. That's what the comments are for. They're there to share information, and that's what we're all about. All right, have a great night, everybody.